For more than 400 years, the name Elizabeth Báthory has been linked to one of the most horrifying legends in human history. A 16th century countess, a fortress in the mountains, hundreds of dead girls, and a rumor so disturbing that it turned her into a permanent symbol of evil. They said she tortured young women in the dark halls of her castle. They said she murdered hundreds of them. And most famously of all, they said she bathed in their blood to stay young. That is the story the world remembers. It is why Elizabeth Báthory became known as the Blood Countess. It is why her name still appears in horror films, Gothic novels, and vampire lore. It is why many people still believe she was the most prolific female serial killer of all time. But what if almost everything you have heard about her is wrong? What if the bloodbaths never happened? What if the most famous female monster in history was not just a killer, but also the victim of one of the most ruthless political character assassinations ever carried out? Because when modern historians started digging into the original records, the story began to crack. And underneath the myth, they found something much darker than a vampire legend. They found power, debt, religion, fear, and a woman who may have known far too much, owned far too much, and stood in the way of people who wanted her gone. So who was Elizabeth Báthory really? A sadistic aristocrat who murdered for pleasure? Or a powerful widow destroyed by politics, greed, and rumor? To answer that, we have to go back to a violent world where cruelty was normal, nobility was above the law, and the truth was whatever the powerful said it was. Elizabeth Báthory was born in 1560 into one of the most powerful noble families in Eastern Europe. And when I say powerful, I do not mean wealthy in the modern sense. I mean the kind of family that shaped kingdoms. Her relatives included princes, military leaders, and even a king. The Báthory name opened doors, controlled land, and commanded fear. But power like that came with a price. Like many elite bloodlines of the time, the family married within its own circles to protect status and property. That meant wealth stayed in the family. But so did illness. Several members of the Báthory line were said to suffer from violent tempers, neurological problems, and seizures. Elizabeth herself reportedly suffered from intense headaches, mood instability, and epileptic episodes. And in the 16th century, medicine was not medicine as we understand it now. It was superstition, ritual, and desperation. Blood was often treated as something mystical, even healing. That matters later. Because from the beginning, Elizabeth's world was one where blood, suffering, and power were already deeply entangled. But the medical beliefs of the era were only part of it. The world around her was brutal in a way that is hard to imagine now. Hungary at the time was under enormous pressure. The Ottoman Empire was expanding. The Habsburgs were fighting for dominance. The entire region was unstable, militarized, and soaked in fear. Violence was not shocking. Violence was ordinary. And for the nobility, peasants were not seen as equals. They were property. Disobedience was punished. Cruelty was expected. Mercy was optional. According to later stories, Elizabeth witnessed horrifying punishments even as a child. Whether every one of those stories is true is impossible to know. But the larger truth is clear. She grew up in a world where the suffering of lower-class people barely counted as a moral issue. That was the air she breathed. Then, at 15 years old, she was married off to Ferenc Nadasdy, a Hungarian nobleman and military commander. The marriage was politically powerful. The wedding was extravagant. And as a gift, Elizabeth was given Chaktice Castle, the fortress that would later become the center of the legend. Ferenc was known as a ruthless soldier, feared for his brutality in the wars against the Ottomans. He was often away on campaign, which left Elizabeth running estates, managing servants, overseeing finances, and maintaining large properties. This is important because the lazy image of Elizabeth as some isolated Gothic madwoman is misleading. By many accounts, she was highly educated, multilingual, and extremely capable. She was not ornamental, she was powerful, and when her husband was gone, she ruled. That alone made her unusual. But then came the darker rumors. Later testimonies claimed that Ferenc and Elizabeth shared a taste for violent punishments, that he showed her cruel methods for disciplining servants, that he normalized pain as spectacle. And after his death in 1604, the story says, whatever restraint had existed around Elizabeth began to disappear. Now widowed, wealthy, and in full control of vast estates, Elizabeth Báthory became more powerful than ever. And according to the legend, that was when the real nightmare began. The accusations against her were horrific. Servant girls, mostly young women, were said to be beaten savagely for minor mistakes, needles pushed under fingernails, burns, starvation, freezing punishment in winter, bodies hidden, funerals requested in suspicious numbers. And at first, if these deaths happened, they largely went ignored, because most of the alleged victims were peasants. And in that society, peasant suffering simply did not carry the same weight. That is one of the ugliest parts of this entire story. If poor girls were disappearing, the system barely cared. But then the situation seems to have changed. According to the accusations, Elizabeth eventually stopped targeting only servant girls and began drawing in daughters of the lower nobility. This was the turning point. Because once noble families believed their daughters might be at risk, the whispers became a scandal. Now the rumors could no longer stay inside castle walls. Now the church noticed. Now local officials started listening. Now the crown had a reason to act. And that brings us to the most dramatic night in the entire story. December 29th, 1610. Palatine Gheorghe Thurzo, one of the highest-ranking men in the Kingdom of Hungary, arrived at Chaktice Castle with armed men. According to the official version, what they found inside was enough to confirm the worst rumors. A dead girl, others dying, victims in various states of torture, servants implicated, the Countess captured. It sounds like the perfect final act in a horror film. The monster exposed, the castle raided, the evil noblewoman finally brought down. But this is exactly where things get complicated. Because the moment you move past the legend and start looking at the case itself, the certainty begins to dissolve. Elizabeth Báthory was never given a normal public trial. That alone should make you stop. For a woman accused of crimes so monstrous that her name would echo across centuries, there was no great courtroom showdown, no transparent legal reckoning, no full public defense. Instead, she was placed under house arrest. Her alleged accomplices were tried. They were tortured. And under torture, they confessed. That matters a lot, because tortured testimony is not clean evidence. It is contaminated from the start. When people are in unbearable pain, they say what they think will stop it. And yet, much of the story that shaped Elizabeth Báthory's reputation comes from confessions extracted that way. This is one reason modern historians remain divided, not because they all believe she was innocent, but because the case against her is far messier than popular culture makes it seem. And then there is motive, because the people investigating Elizabeth were not operating in a vacuum. King Matthias II reportedly owed her a significant financial debt, a debt tied to war and money the crown struggled to repay. Think about that for a second. One of the most powerful women in the region was also a creditor. If she were politically neutralized, that problem might disappear. Then there was religion. The period was soaked in tension between Catholics and Protestants. Elizabeth came from a Protestant environment. The Habsburg power structure around her was heavily Catholic. That does not automatically prove a conspiracy, but it absolutely means the political atmosphere around her was toxic. And finally, there was the issue of power itself. Elizabeth was not just a widow sitting quietly in mourning. She controlled land, fortresses, wealth, influence. In unstable times, that kind of independence could be dangerous, especially if powerful men decided it was inconvenient. This is why some modern scholars argue that the case against her may have been exaggerated or even strategically amplified to destroy her, not necessarily because she was saintly, but because she was useful as a target, a feared woman, a rich woman, a politically exposed woman. A woman easier to demonize than to negotiate with. And once you ask that question, the entire myth begins to look different, because the image most people carry of Elizabeth Báthory is not based purely on contemporary evidence. It is based on layers of storytelling added over time. And the greatest example of that is the most famous claim of all, the blood bathing. If you ask almost anyone what makes Elizabeth Báthory infamous, that is the detail they remember, that she killed girls and bathed in their blood to preserve her youth. It is the perfect Gothic image. It is grotesque, it is unforgettable, and it may be completely false. Because in the original trial-related material, in the testimonies usually associated with the case, there is no clear contemporary evidence for the famous image of her soaking in a tub of blood. That detail appears much later, long after her death, long after the legal proceedings, long after memory had already begun turning history into legend. In other words, the most iconic part of her story may not be history at all. It may be myth layered on top of fear. And once that myth entered the public imagination, it spread fast. Of course it did. A beautiful noblewoman, a remote castle, murdered girls, blood and vanity. It was irresistible. The story became bigger than the woman, then bigger than the evidence, then bigger than reality itself. Over time, Elizabeth Báthory stopped being a historical figure and became a symbol, a monster, a warning, a Gothic archetype, almost a supernatural being. But the truth may be more disturbing than that, because if she was guilty, then the real horror is not that she was some immortal blood-drinking demon. It is that she was entirely human, a human being born into a world where class protected cruelty, a world where power blurred morality, a world where the suffering of ordinary people could vanish behind stone walls and noble titles. And if she was also exaggerated, if her crimes were inflated, theatricalized, and mythologized for political reasons, then that tells us something equally chilling. It tells us history does not always remember the worst monster. Sometimes it remembers the most useful one. So where does that leave us? Was Elizabeth Báthory innocent? Probably not. There is enough smoke around her story that it is hard to believe there was no fire. Too many accusations, too much fear around her household, too many testimonies, even if many were flawed. But was she the impossible, supernatural, blood-bathing butcher of 650 virgins that legend created? That is far harder to defend. The number itself is deeply suspect. The most sensational details appear late, and the political context surrounding her downfall is impossible to ignore. Which means the most likely answer is also the least comfortable one. Elizabeth Báthory may have been cruel. She may have been abusive. She may have presided over real suffering and real death. But the monstrous version of her, the one preserved for centuries, was probably shaped, sharpened, and amplified into something almost mythological. Not just because people feared evil, but because people loved stories. Especially stories where evil wears a crown. And maybe that is why her name survived. Not because the truth was simple, but because the lie was better. A countess who killed for beauty. A castle full of screams. A woman so monstrous she became immortal. That version of the story was too powerful to die. Even if parts of it were invented. Even if the most famous image of all was fiction. Even if the real Elizabeth Báthory was something much messier and much more human. And maybe that is the final twist here. Maybe the darkest part of the Elizabeth Báthory story is not what happened in the castle. Maybe it is what happened after. How rumor became memory, how memory became legend, how legend became fact, and how, 4 centuries later, millions of people still know her not as she was, but as history wanted her to be. So, what do you think? Was Elizabeth Báthory a sadistic killer whose crimes were softened by time? Or was she a brutal noblewoman whose real cruelty was later transformed into one of the greatest horror myths ever told? Either way, one thing is certain. She was not a vampire. She was something worse. She was possible.